I want to say that was a crazy year, but it seems to me that every year since 2020 has been a crazy
It doesn't
year.
stop.
No, it doesn't stop.
Hi everyone, my name is Timothy McKay and I'm the founder of OK RDY. I'm excited because today we launch episode 1 as part of our new Trailblazer series. The Trailblazer series is a new initiative as part of the Australian Women in Security Network's Women in Security Mentoring Program. Throughout this series, we'll focus on capturing and sharing the unique career journeys of a range of different government, industry and security professionals who will share their stories about how they got started, mentoring tips, and ultimately help demystify the diverse opportunities, pathways, and showcase some role models in the security industry. Episode 1 features Abigail Bradshaw, who is the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. Abigail worked for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, most recently as the Deputy Coordinator on the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, and prior to that as Head of the National Security Division. She has held senior roles in the Department of Home Affairs, offshore, covering Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa, and as the department's inaugural Chief Risk Officer. She was the Deputy Commander of Maritime Border Command during the height of the people smuggling trade. Abigail began her career, as we'll hear in the clip, in the Royal Australian Navy and was awarded the Conspicuous Cross in 2005. In this episode, you'll hear Abigail talk about her own origin story, about getting started, about the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, her role and coming on during COVID in such a critical leadership position, as well as her tips and advice for mentoring and emerging security talent. We hope you enjoy episode 1 and we look forward to seeing you as part of the mentoring program. You can sign up at the AWSN website and enjoy the series. Thanks, let's get into it. Cool. Hi, Abby.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us for the very first of the Trailblazer series for the Australian Women in Security Network Mentoring Program.
Well, thank you for having me, Tim. I never thought I'd be involved in something called trailblazing, and it's a huge privilege to be part of this awesome program. So thank you.
No, thank you. It's a new program that we're doing, and we're interviewing a series of leaders and really reverse engineering their story, or in this case, your story, and the unique journey that you've gone through, so that people that are interested in security and career pathways can just learn a little bit about your experience and whether you went from A to B to C in a natural linear way, or whether you kind of took a few detours along the way and what you learned as part of that experience. So thank you for being involved. So we'll start with the first question, and I've got this as part of my notes. This is the Abigail Bradshaw origin story.
Oh.
And so as we begin, could you tell us a little bit about ACSC, its remit, and your current responsibility as the head of the organisation?
Sure can. So the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, our mission is to make Australia the most secure place to connect online. And so what that means is the Cybersecurity Centre provides advice and assistance to any Australian or any Australian business, any Australian government entity, on how to keep themselves secure online from a technical perspective, how to respond to and defend yourself from all those cyber threats that you hear about. And importantly, and what makes us different is we operate from inside the agency called the Australian Signals Directorate. Now, that is a foreign intelligence agency. And 75 years ago, when ASD started, we actually provided cybersecurity advice and assistance way back then too. Back in those days, it was called communication security or information security. And our services were provided predominantly to the military or to government entities. But as technology and cyber has become mainstream and we're all connected, both in our personal lives and our private lives and our professional lives, businesses, schools, whatever you're doing operates by virtue of connectivity through this thing called the internet. In 2018, the government made the decision that ASD, through the Australian Cyber Security Centre, would provide its advice and assistance to all Australians. So we run a 1300 cyber hotline that any Australian can ring and get advice and assistance. But we also use that foreign intelligence to inform our advice and assistance. And that means we're able to draw on 75 years of Five Eye relationships, so information passing between our closest allies about what global threats are out there, what global capabilities are out there, and we use that knowledge to inform our advice and assistance. So we have a really special role in the Australian community, which I'm immensely proud of.
Wonderful. And so next I wanted to jump backwards a little bit to yourself. And so when you were first beginning your career, you did so, I believe, in the Royal Australian Navy. And was military and public service always something that you wanted to do? Because I'm curious how someone with a Bachelor of Laws and Asian Studies naturally, or was it unnaturally, finds themselves advancing Australia's national security agenda.
Okay. So I'm going to have to go way back in my brain. So for me, no, it's a natural transition for me. My father was an intelligence officer in the Army and then went on later in his career to work until his retirement in the Australian intelligence community. So I had always had a fascination with that side of the business, the intelligence world. I felt a strong and intimate connection with military service. My grandfather was in the Royal Australian Air Force. I felt a very strong calling to serve my country, and I've travelled and lived all around the world, and we do live in the best country in the world. There's no question about it. So for me, it was a very natural transition. A Bachelor of Laws, I started my life as a lawyer in the Royal Australian Navy, and of course Asian Studies was pretty core business for anyone who was a student in the 90s. That we were part in those days of an awakening that we had a strong connection with the Asia Pacific region, and that we ought to get a stronger, in order to have those stronger relationships with our neighbours, our close neighbours. Many people studied Asian studies and Indonesian and Japanese, and in my era when I went to university. For me, starting out as a lawyer was in the Royal Australian Navy was brilliant. Joining the military was great because everyone gets a core level of training that gives you real confidence that there's no problem that you can come across that you can't resolve if you apply a certain algorithm or set of critical thinking. And it also exposes you to a huge amount of leadership training, which the military really invests in. And I guess I understood from my time in the Navy about a whole bunch of practical issues and problems which were out there, but also I grew a great love of leadership, and I just knew I had to go broader than that legal field, that I really felt I wanted to go beyond providing advice on matters as important and as critical as that role is. I really understood after a decade in the Navy that I really wanted to lead teams of my own, and that's how it all started.
So with yourself and your father and your grandfather really public service and national security is really the family business in many ways for you.
It is the family business now. But ironically, my sister, who studied biomedical science, I have a running joke. She sells drugs and body parts, and she actually really does. She works for, I won't say the name, but a large pharmaceutical company. And it's remarkable for me how different, as close as we are, that we can be so incredibly different. So I've continued that line, and my dear sister has the most ridiculous stories at Christmas time of photos of body parts that she's and titanium pins and blood plasma. It makes for a very entertaining Christmas. Anyway, she's not so interested in the Canberra politics as me and Dad. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, the sister's helping Australia in very different ways.
She is.
Yeah, indeed. So the next question I've got, and this can be cut, so if you want to have water or anything. So if you could go back to your earlier self, because we've got a lot of mentees as part of this program. So for context, if you said, leaving high school, or whether it was when you were doing your Bachelor of Laws or the first job itself, what would be one piece of advice that you wish you would have known back then that you know now? What would be that one thing?
Yeah, it's an awesome question, and I always think back to all those things that my mum said to me back then that I now say to my two sons, and how they just never resonate until you're 50 years old, like me. Statements like "the world is your oyster." I never really understood the true meaning of that until I got to now. So I'm going to be greedy. I'm not going to say one. There's actually three, I think. And the first one is don't wait. I can't believe that I graduated in 1996, and I'm almost 30 years in the workforce. It goes so quick. So don't wait. Don't wait till you there's no algorithm for this. There's no perfect pattern. Jump in and have a go. The next is the importance of building a network, and I've spoken about this before. It's something that does not always come naturally to people, particularly if you're an introvert, and actually to often to women. But actually, I find my husband is just great at it, and so it's super important to build that network. It sounds Machiavellian, but it's actually not. Networks are super important for keeping you informed in terms of what's going on. How do you connect what's happening in a priority in your context, in your workplace, or in your field of interest with what's happening more strategically at a different level, and giving you real perspective. And of course, for opportunities. Of course, I'm a massive fan of AWSN because it provides an enormous framework and a great set of people to help you if you're not sort of naturally inclined to do that. And the last one is always find time for yourself. And actually, that doesn't seem as important before you become encumbered with partners and husbands and or wives and children, but starting to get into that practice of self-reflection, understanding yourself, understanding how you respond to pressure, whether or not, having that perspective of standing back. Are you centering yourself? Are you looking after yourself in a holistic way? Because that will enable you, taking that time out and starting that discipline early in your career and preserving it will really stand you in great stead. I say this having just had 5 weeks off, and this is my first day back in the office. My New Year's resolution is to take that time and ensure I'm giving myself that space every day, even if it's only 5 minutes, do whatever it is, mindfulness, bit of yoga, bit of stretching, go for a walk. What is that time that you're going to give yourself each day? Because actually you connect better with people, you manage your time better, you think through problems better if you actually have the discipline to consider yourself each day and what you're bringing.
Oh, wonderful insights. Thank you. So the next set of questions we go into a bit more in your current role. So I believe you were appointed the head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre in around March of 2020. So as we jump forward to today, there were quite a few things happening in March 2020 around the globe, and particularly for workplaces all across the country. So firstly, from a leadership perspective, how was it joining an organisation as COVID was entering its peak? And secondly, what were some of the challenges you faced as a senior leader in the organisation during that challenging and what seemed ever evolving period?
Yeah, that was, I want to say that was a crazy year, but it seems to me that every year since 2020 has been a crazy
year.
It
doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't stop. What will 2023 bring?
Yeah.
So from a cyber perspective, 2020 was an incredible year because we talked about cyber from the perspective of, its growing importance because of our connectedness through the internet. And of course, during COVID, when people were pushed into lockdown, connectedness through the internet became more important.
Yeah.
Not just to communicate, but also for the purposes of continuing to work, continuing to go to school, accessing health, accessing information. And so what that meant from a cyber perspective is that the threat surface actually grew because more and more Australians were connecting online, but also the importance of those connections became, they became greater targets for those that would seek to interfere or disrupt that connectivity or to steal our secrets or our communications, or for cyber criminals to come in and take advantage of people's connectedness. And all of those things happened all at once. And so, of course, we observed very quickly cyber criminals coming on board to try and dupe Australians into giving over private or personal information or to gain access to people's financial accounts or your bank accounts or superannuation, for example. And so there were a huge number of challenges in maintaining our advice and assistance to Australians and to defending really critical health networks, Services Australia, and those payments and information services, the security of applications which were designed to support personnel, and so people and all the services that are available through those, and the security of those applications, particularly to the extent that they absorb personal information. So all of that meant for the ACSC it was an enormous workload. But I think, importantly, with any great challenge like that comes great opportunity. And for us, 2020 was really the beginning of a huge awakening in the Australian public about the need to be cyber secure. It gave us a real platform to talk about cyber security, and of course with the events of 2022 and two very high profile cyber compromises, which meant the personal information of many Australians was spilt on the stolen and spilt on the dark web. Those two have been opportunities for us to really give voice to the importance of cybersecurity, both for individuals and for entities. So that's it in a professional sort of cyber sense. From a leadership perspective, it was one of the most challenging leadership appointments of my life. One, because I was joining a highly technical organisation, and I am not a technical person. You said yourself, I have a Bachelor of Laws and a Bachelor of Asian Studies Indonesian. I don't have a master's in coding. And so I needed to acquire a level of understanding from what I had, which was a very theoretical understanding of how cyber worked, in a context where 50% of my workforce weren't in the building. And the things that you would normally do when you joined a new organisation, and particularly when you take up a leadership role, like walking the floor, meeting people, talking to people, putting names to faces, and the cues that you would normally take about, physically I know that section sits there and that person sits there, were all taken away. And I was trying to learn about a team and get a sense of who people were and what drove them, as well as start to understand some very technical language and ways of speaking and ways of communicating that people with highly technological skills communicate very differently to my previous experience in the public service. And so really that meant really forcing myself into those harder ways of communicating. I actually ended up putting together, for me, a queue of people and little photos so that I could remember, that's what that person does, and writing myself little notes about, my last conversation, because you're trying so hard to absorb all this information so quickly in circumstances where the demand on our services were huge and really high. But boy, we learn a lot about what we can do. And importantly, for an intelligence agency, the amount of work that can actually be done usefully low side really extended us and pushed us to think about, does everything really need to happen in a SCIF? And the answer is no. And especially with cybersecurity, because of course the cyber criminals aren't operating in a SCIF. And most of the people that we're talking to, if you're helping everyday Australians and, critical infrastructure owners or any business owner, they're calling you from the low side. So much of that work we were able to look at more logically and say, a whole bunch of that stuff can be done online. Even our help desk operators, many of them could operate from home, from making sure that the lines were simply connected to them by mobile, and on we went.
And a huge change from what was pre-2020 and the remit of ACSC and those types of things, with the outreach and the public profile, as you're saying, and that kind of dovetails nicely into the next question. So from outside looking in, there appears to be a significant change in the government's security public presence. As you said, ASD has been around for 75 years now, in a variety of forms, doing a lot of different types of security and intelligence work. Initially as a secret, faceless facing organisation, now I find it juxtaposed in many ways to, I think late last year, I saw an article of the ASD's Director General, Rachel Noble, at one of Canberra's cafes, eating a burger, talking about cybersecurity, and in a very public format. And so that's obviously very different than the faceless, nameless kind of organisation that we had previously that wasn't publicly facing. So I'm wondering, why has it been important for ASD, and through your role with ACSC, for that more public and open shift around cyber awareness?
Yeah. Well, firstly, from the perspective of being an intelligence agency with, I think it's a great credit to Australia and our democracy that you can actually read the Intelligence Services Act and understand exactly what powers and functions the Australian Signals Directorate has. They are open and available and transparent on the face of it. So I think it's a really important part about public trust that we are transparent about what we do and what powers we have. When you have great powers, that comes, I think, with a responsibility to take part in those public transparent processes, like Senate estimates, like having a burger and a chat with journalists to talk about what you do. We just don't talk about how we do it.
Yeah.
Which is important as well. I think from a cybersecurity perspective, there has been great benefit in us being able to speak about that publicly in order to give visibility about what it is that taxpayers get for the investment that they make into the national security apparatus. We're very fortunate to have a public-facing role like cybersecurity in which you can demonstrate the benefits of intelligence, top secret intelligence, informing our understanding of the cyber threat, where it might come from, the tradecraft that those criminals might use, the targets that they might attack, which puts our operators in a position where we are able to, and on hundreds of occasions last year, call entities before they are victims of a ransomware attack, for example, or very early in the stages of one of those attacks, and assist them to put their defences up. From a preventative perspective, just like doctors, of course, prevention in the cyber context is going to be better than cure.
Yeah.
And so we have a responsibility to speak up, to speak regularly, to ensure that our messages are heard about the importance of great passwords or passphrases, patching and updating, and multi-factor authentication, for example, to make sure that CISOs everywhere understand what the essential 8 are, those essential mitigation strategies about how to defend networks against cyber attacks. So I don't see it so much as a burden. I see it as a necessary part of maintaining public trust and transparency. And actually, when you read the Intelligence Services Act, Section 71C says provide advice and assistance. Yeah. And that means providing helpful advice at the low side, free of technical jargon, or in highly technical jargon in a way which best serves the Australian community.
That's great. And as you mentioned yourself, not being fully technical when you were kind of coming into the role and your past experience, but having a deep understanding of other critical areas in intelligence and military and the like. Throughout your career so far, I imagine when you were joining the organisation, you yourself discovered a few different things, but I imagine that cyber and national security has changed as new technologies have been developed, new courses and academic curricula have come out, and new actors have emerged. What would you say, in your opinion, is the thing that most people get most wrong or is most misunderstood about working in the actual security industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. About cyber, let me talk about cyber first and the Signals Directorate and the intelligence community. There is a misconception, I think, to work in the Signals Directorate or in cyber that you have to be a highly technical person, that you need to have a Masters of Computer Science or understand coding or network architecture. That is not so. Of course, we need people with those skills. But in order to fulfill that function, providing advice and assistance, we need people who are linguists. So that's a super important function, of course, in an intelligence context. We need people who are analysts, who can analyse information. We need people, particularly in cyber, who are communications experts. So people who can take highly technical advice and put that in a meaningful context that's actually going to make sense to someone who doesn't have a master's of computer science. Because we have, I like to say, 26 million constituents, and we need to be able to communicate meaningfully with each and every one of those that are connected to the internet. The other thing I would say more broadly about national security, because people often I often talk to people who say, I would love to work in the intelligence community or national security. I just don't know, have I got the right skills, or, how would I start? Firstly, the nature of national security is so much broader than it used to be in my father's day, for example. He's going to hate me for saying that. It makes him sound 100 years old. But where there was a very sort of military defence understanding, focus on what national security meant. And I think particularly with COVID, for example, we understand now that national security is far more broader concept that has to do with supply chains and resilience. And the notion that you can divide economic security, for example, or social unity from national security has been completely turned on its head. They are, in fact, a continuum. So you don't seek to be secure for the sake of being secure. You seek to be secure so that you are able to be prosperous and that society can be unified, and so it's a sort of self-perpetuating cycle. So to that extent, national security now is not the realm necessarily of people with masters in national security or that very defence military focus. It is a realm in which we will only succeed and be highly prosperous, secure and united if we take people with a whole bunch of different multidisciplinary views, people who understand economics, people who understand supply chain and supply chain resilience, not in its technical sense, but perhaps in a different sense. People who support those people. We need great people in recruitment, great people in who understand money and investment and how to drive enormous programs. ASD has, through the funding of Red Spice, we will invest in some enormous technological capabilities which will assist us to do our functions. You cannot do that without people who are great project managers and program managers and understand how to spend and phase money and build capabilities and run RFT processes. It's absolutely critical. And so I would challenge a person to tell me that they couldn't see themselves in a role in national security, because actually the opportunities at the moment are endless. We in ASD are recruiting 1,900 people over the next few years, and I would challenge anyone who says that there's not a role for them in our organisation.
Thank you. Yeah, it really seems like in the current day, 2023 and onwards, as aligned with the Red Spice initiative, that it's really the diversity of people and personality, job types, career interests, that's the future workforce, and that's definitely what we need.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think, people say, oh, that's so strange that you would start as in my case, you start as a Navy lawyer and you end up as the head of cybersecurity. How does that happen? Well, quite naturally, actually, and not with the notion in 1996 that I thought that's where I wanted to end up. But no one ever does one job for life anymore, or the very, very, very few would. And national security and public service is actually a profession of its own, because, as you say, you need those multidisciplinary views. And the job I did before I came to cyber was in the National Bushfire Recovery Agency. And you might say, well, what on earth would you learn from that going into cyber? Actually, I learned a huge amount from that, because that was an agency that was set up after the 2020 bushfires, headed by Andrew Colvin, who had just finished up as being the AFP commissioner. And the job there was to bring a real national effort to the assistance of Australians who were under a huge amount of stress and pressure, because guess what? Their livelihoods through their jobs, through their businesses were on the line because they couldn't operate.
Yeah, we were literally on fire.
Yeah, that's right, literally, or smoke damaged or whatever. And you were trying to feed information to people about assistance, about programs, about government assistance that was available when they were under enormous stress. So I learned a huge amount about how people and Australians like to absorb information.
Yeah,
of course, completely applicable in the context of the current role. And I like to think of the progression through all of those different roles. I think if you address it from the perspective that you will learn something from every one of those roles, and simply because you start with one organisation, we have people that come into ASD that might start, sort of graphic design role that will end up in vastly different roles later on because of the opportunities that are available. I mean, you don't start with a degree or a diploma or a qualification and your learning stops there. Learning's a lifetime sport.
Yeah, and that ties itself really well into our next set, which is on mentorship and the emerging security talent. So you touched a little bit on your most immediate role before this one. I also noted from some of your public profile information, there's probably much more that I couldn't see, but you've worked across military and public service, both onshore and offshore, working with everything from maritime border command to sub-Saharan Africa, a national security at PM&C, and as you said, bushfire recovery agency, to now leading up cyber for Australia in many ways. With all of that, how have you found it personally with navigating those changes? As you said, you don't always start. Nowadays, you don't start with one particular job that you're going to just do for the next 50 years. And obviously, those are very varied jobs that you've taken different things away from. But I'm curious, how have you navigated, and have you found that process easy? Or have you had a mentor yourself to kind of go for advice? Was taking the job at the National Bushfire Agency something that you had a conversation with people about to go, is this what I should be doing? Or was it just an internal call, no, I have to do this?
Yeah, super interesting. So I have never set myself a 5-year plan that, in 5 years I'm going to be doing X or Y. I've been fortunate enough to have great people around me. Now, I've invested as leaders. Some of those were from the military. I met incredible people like Tim Barrett, David Johnson and Mike Noonan, all whom were head of Maritime Border Command when I was working there. All became chiefs of Navy and now, of course, David Johnson's the Vice Chief of the Defence Force. All of them taught me, despite all being in the Navy, all of them taught me something completely different about leadership. Tim Barrett taught me about governance and the importance of governance from a risk management perspective. David Johnson taught me about planning, about the importance of having a plan for today, but also having a plan for when that turns to custard. and what you're going to do, what you're going to sacrifice today in order to preserve a benefit that you want to reap next week, next month, in 12 months' time. And Mike Noonan really taught me about backing myself and taking risks in an operational sense, and the importance of having a leader that will let you do that and then catch you hopefully before you fall. So all three completely different things I learned from those leaders. Rachel Noble, who's been my boss, was my boss now as the Director General of ASD, but was also my boss in the Department of Home Affairs, really taught me about the importance of seeing things and making decisions today, but forecasting how those decisions might be translated or understood, or the narrative that might be around them next week or the week after, or how that issue might be understood from other perspectives. And also the importance of communication as a leader. And by that I mean you will have many thoughts through your head as you absorb different conversations, and as a leader quite often at very senior levels. And how quickly and accurately are you disseminating those views or that context to empower your workforce to make decisions and judgments of their own, that they're going to be sound because they understand the strategic context and they understand the thinking and the moving parts that are happening more broadly. So those are all the sort of lessons that you know, if you want to get on, you really study those leaders, the good bits about them and the bad bits, you know, because we all have strengths and weaknesses, and really try to think about what is the thing that I want to emanate. And then quite often when I get myself in a stressful situation, I think to myself, what would that leader do in that context? And before it gets out of hand, I maintain that network of past leaders, and I, feeling the confidence that I'm able to send them a text and say, hey, I just want to talk to you about something. I'm thinking about moving this way or doing this, or using them as a sounding board. I think too, if you are trying to plan your career by looking at APS jobs or Seek or whatever, and that's the way that you're finding opportunities for yourself, you are missing probably 90% of the opportunities that are out there that you might be able to take advantage of if you maintain that network, making yourself available, not being scared to say to people, I'm interested in making a move, please tell me if something comes about. Don't try and make it perfect. So that job that's come up, or that opportunity that's available, might not have been the one that you had down in your 5-year plan. But if it offers, think about what opportunities does that offer you. And bushfires was not on my plan. PM&C were not on my plan. But I learned a huge amount from the exposure. And often, I'll tell you a small secret, the jobs that I have hated the most have been the ones that I've learnt the most from. I'm not going to tell you which jobs I hate, by the way. Those that put you under enormous stress, those that place you in contexts which you are not comfortable with because you're not the technical expert, because that's not the agency that you've worked for 5 years, 10 years, because, there's people there that you don't know, or perhaps you don't know a soul. Those are the ones where I've gone, and I now understand how that piece of the apparatus actually sits in a broader context. I now understand, what happens to those pieces of paper when they make their way up to Parliament House, and all the influences that are on that pathway and on that trajectory that I now feel empowered that I can influence. And I understand, how that policy proposal might be understood, or that investment proposition might be regarded by other agencies or other people, and therefore I'm able to influence that and articulate it in a way that's going to probably, resonate much better.
Yeah, wonderful, and great to hear. We refer to it as a board of mentors as part of it, that you shouldn't look to get all your advice or something from one person in particular, and great to kind of access a range of people with diverse backgrounds and different experiences so that you can pick and choose and then apply that to your own personal circumstances and journey.
Yeah, no, it's super important. I mean, I met people at PM&C who, after spending then 20 years in the national security community, when I went to PM&C, I understood, oh my goodness, there's also all these other social policy issues that are actually really important and they engage people's time. How remarkable, and huge investments. And I understood about the intersect between those things and those policy issues and national security infrastructure and industry. And it really enriches your view of national security rather than detracts from it.
Yeah.
And, I maintain those contacts now. Even Dr. David Gruen, who's the head of the ABS, we go and have lunch and chat about who would have thought, like in the world of statistics. And we have remarkable conversations. And he has incredibly different views. I don't always agree with them, but they certainly enrich your own perspective about how your views might sit. And also, as you get older, you really need to expose yourself to other views, particularly when you're in Canberra and you don't live life. You live a great life, of course. I love Canberra, but it is not always symbolic or typical of the way that a lot of Australians live and the way they see things. So hugely important to keep that board of views, that board of mentors open.
And that's where I guess we'll give a little bit of a shout out to the ASD-backed Australian Women Security Network mentoring platform, where through that sponsorship from ASD, then we've been able to create that national network where people from all areas across Australia can start to connect in and get different areas of experience juxtaposed with maybe their own view or in a regional remote area that they didn't necessarily have access to, from that area as well. So that's something that's been great to work on as well through the 2020 kind of changing period and the need to address and attract different types of talent.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the last questions now. So you answered a little bit in the last question, but the second last question is, as a trailblazer and our first trailblazer for this series as part of the Women in Security Mentoring Program, what would be your piece of advice for mentees interested in starting or transitioning from other fields into security or cyber?
Yeah, it's a great question. I revert back to my first piece of advice to myself: don't wait. Right? It goes too quick. And there are a wealth of opportunities. Don't think of yourself as starting at ground zero and that you don't actually have a skill set, a set of views, or a value proposition that you can offer. The competition is on at the moment for talented people. In ASD, for example, I think, one of the things that we try to preserve and that's really unique about ASD is the diversity of thought. And the openness and inclusivity is quite, for me, quite stark moving from other parts of the public service into ASD, how strongly that view is held. We have people who are fascinated with algorithms and patterns and highly technical detail, but we equally have people with language skills or analytic skills or communication skills or project management skills. So that diversity for a relatively small organisation is amazing, and it is one of our great strengths. So first of all, of course, I'm going to say go to asd.gov.au/careers, and I challenge you to tell me that there is not a role for you. Secondly, a second bit of advice, don't try and make it perfect. That first move might get you into a national security agency. And what you want to do is get yourself in the door. And then, things can move once you acquire actually a better understanding of how the organisation works, it might actually be a benefit going into an area. Don't try and make it perfect. And lastly, use that network, talk to people. Even if you don't know them very well, Canberra's a very small place. I mean, we just worked out that you went to uni with my goddaughter. There you go. You just ask 2 questions of connectivity and you'll find someone who, start those conversations, go have a coffee about, okay, what's it like? I want to move into national security. What's it like? What agencies do what? Because that's quite often a bit opaque, not always explicit on the wrapper. And get started. Don't wait.
Wonderful. And so this is our very last question, our bonus question. We're an Australian startup company, proudly founded here in Australia, and we love tackling big problems. So we're planning to ask this to every Trailblazer. So if you had $1 million to invest in an Australian startup company around what we call a BHAG, or a big, hairy, audacious goal, what would that startup be trying to solve and why?
Wow. You didn't say it. Well, I'll tell you what my big, hairy, audacious goal.
Yeah.
I would love to know what the best possible policy advice would be for Australia to traverse the next 5 to 10 years, because you probably have heard lots of people, the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, talk about the era that we're transitioning now as one that's more complex than one we've seen probably since the 1930s, the big sort of movements in global powers, military build-up, particularly in the Asia Pacific region where we live, conflict in Europe, and from my perspective now, the use of cyber in an integrated way with conventional warfare, the use of non-military or so-called grey zone tactics that actually make it more important for us to preserve our resilience, to think very carefully about who our trusted partners are, how we build sovereign capability, but that at the same time maintain global supply chains. I think this is one of the I used to go to work in the 2010s when people smuggling was at its height, and I used to think, wow, this is such a difficult strategic context, and now I think, if that's all we had to worry about, it's vastly more complex strategic context. So if I had a startup that could resolve and provide perfect policy advice about how to traverse the next 5 to 10 years with the economic issues that we're facing at the same time as traditional national security issues, I didn't, and I was confident it could pop out the right advice at the right time. That's where I'd invest it. Now, if that doesn't come off, then actually what we really need is the best and brightest, most innovative, diverse thinking people to come and join the national security community so you can actually be part of providing that advice. And, in particular, of course, you'd want to join ASD because it's the best place to work.
You heard it here first. All right. Thank you very much for your time. And I appreciate you being part of the very first Trailblazer series for the Australian Women in Security Network mentoring program.
Thank you, Tim. It's an honour. And I look forward to some of the more face-to-face AWSN forums this year. I got such a kick and such energy out of being part of that network last year. A little secret, mentees get as much out of mentoring as mentors. For me, the older I get, the more important it is to check how I'm thinking about issues, about how I'm thinking about leadership and what will resonate, about how I'll lead teams, about what I actually think the problems are. I get more out of the people that I spend time with so-called mentoring, hopefully as much as they do. So thank you for the work you do. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much.